How the Umayyad Caliphate changed Spanish society. Before we can discuss how Islam changed Spain, we must learn about how Spain became Islamic. To do this, there will be a brief explanation of the factors that made Spain vulnerable to conquest by the Muslims. After that, we will go into why Islamic Spain was so important to Western civilization. Through their commingled cultures and diversity, Islamic Spain changed the fabric of Western Europe and the Middle East. We will also explore how this Titan culture began to decline in the High Middle Ages before eventually falling in the early modern period. When Spain was invaded by the Umayyads, Spain was ruled by the Germanic Goth people. Tariq ibn Ziyad would become the first ruler, or caliph, of Islamic Spain, and he and his descendants from the Middle East would bring one of the most enduring and fascinating material cultures in world history. Also one of the most multicultural civilizations in the historical record. The majority of people in Islamic Spain were still Christians, with a sizable Jewish minority and a dominant Muslim minority. The Umayyad Caliphate was a vital time in Islamic art. Muslim ideas were mixed with Hispano-Roman and Visigothic architecture and created a wonderful marriage between the cultures. From the very beginning of Islamic Spain, there was a mixed culture. We do not know if the country was settled by Muslims, Muslim Arabs, or Berbers from North Africa in the first half of the 8th century, but the Muslim people would change Spain forever. Within a couple of generations, a culture began to form that would adapt to the local conditions and realities of life. But in 750 AD, Islamic Spain would go through a major change. The Umayyad Caliphate would fall into civil war and the Caliphate would be succeeded by the Abbasids. These new rulers would bring a new culture. Instead of being more in tune with Syria and the Arabian tribes of Iraq, they felt an affinity with Iranian culture. But a Umayyad, Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah, who would come to be called Al-Dakil, the incomer. He and his successors would play a vital and unique part in forging a new entity of Al-Andalus. Hisham I was the emir who introduced a legal system based on Muslim precedent that would be used throughout the Western Islamic world. The Umayyad dynasty would reach the peak of its powers in the 10th century under Abd al-Rahman III. He would adopt the title Caliph, which signified that he was the successor to the rule of the Prophet Muhammad, and thus challenged all other Muslim rulers. The 200 years of Islamic rule in Al-Andalus transformed the southern part of Spain into an actor within international relations. Spain would become a rich producer of consumer goods thanks to the development of agricultural techniques, the cultivation of the silkworm, and the introduction of rice and vegetables to the Mediterranean. But the Umayyads got too big and would fracture into many different Islamic kingdoms by the year 1031, and by 1492 they will all eventually fall. Now that the preamble is done, we can talk about the society and culture of Islamic Spain, and we are going to learn and hear about some really awe-inspiring things. I will try to reconstruct the ordinary life of an Arab Muslim in Al-Andalus, but it will be nearly impossible. Historians know that the people of Al-Andalus practiced metallurgy and manufactured many forms of textiles. Unfortunately, as was common back then, Al-Andalus had slaves, mainly from Scandinavian and Slavic areas. Muslims, especially Muslims from the Middle East, were a social elite, but there were Christian natives of Spain whose ancestors had converted to Islam. Muslims lived side by side with Christians. They called Mozarabs because they acquired an Arab culture but remained Christian. There was, of course, flare-ups of religious tension that would occasionally explode, such as an incident in the ninth century when a group of Christians sought martyrdom by insulting the faith of Muslims and provoking cruel payback, but these cases were rare, and the Umayyads and their Islamic successors maintained a workable balance between Christian and Muslim communities. Another significant group was the Jews, who played a vital role in Al-Andalus society because they were among the richest and most successful merchants from Spain. And this is what I'm talking about, and this is what I was talking about at the start of this video. The commingling of cultures, desperate groups taking ideas from each other and living together and making a new culture together. This is how Islam was changing Spanish society, by adding all these new and different influences and cultures and making something entirely new and all its own. But these groups did have one thing in common. They had allegiance to centers of issues outside of Spain, and this caused a more tolerant society to form. On that topic, let's talk about how the people ruled this society. The Muslims invested in the arts and established a great many colleges and libraries and public baths. Slavery will also be abolished. Bastions of architecture like the Grand Mosque would be built in. And speaking of mosques, I would like to speak about the Grand Mosque of Cordoba, which is actually still in use as a Catholic church. Every luxury art imaginable was used to make this religious palace. Gold, silver, and other metals, marble, all forms of textiles. And was filled with books, containers for jewels, and precious substances. And this was just one example of the brilliance of the architecture of Islamic Spain. I will now explain the society of the Tafa kingdoms up to the year 2000, 1031. It's often seen as a period decline for Islamic Spain, and while that is true in some capacity, Islamic society was still a violent society, and would go on to exist in some capacity for the next over 460 years. The Safavid kingdoms were bickering Islamic states, and architecture was slowed down. It was a period of war and decline, but society still functioned. But how did it get like this? It began when the Caliphate of War fell after the war that took place between 1010 to 1013 AD. By the 10th century, Islamic Spain was broken up between various groups called the Almoravids. The Almoravids were Berbers from North Africa, and they had a very distinct culture from the Middle Eastern Muslims. Even though the Cordoban Caliphate would fall in 1031 AD, Islamic Spain was still a force to be reckoned with in the artistic sphere. In terms, Islamic Spain's textiles were still elegant. During the peak of the Caliphate in Cordoba, the main textile manufacturer was Hirasham, but during the Almoravid period, the city of Amirka became the center of textile production and became one of the first great manufacturing cities of the Iberian Peninsula. This shows that even after then the Cordoba Caliphate in 1031, Islamic Spain still had a strong society and culture influence and would influence for years to come. Even today, Islamic Spain has left its impact on modern Spanish society with its many great works such as libraries, universities, and colleges. This is why I chose them as my video topic, because it's so fascinating to me to see how a culture, such an alien culture, formed and shaped the country. We don't usually associate with that culture. But all things must come to an end, whether they were good or bad or somewhere in between. They must come to an end eventually, and Islamic Spain would come to an end in the year 1492 after the Spanish Reconquista, thus ending the medieval period and jump-starting the early modern age. At the end of it all, what did Islamic Spain leave as its legacy? Was it awe-inspiring feats of architecture, places of learning, castles? I say it's none of these. Islamic Spain's greatest impact was on society and was on the society and culture of Spain. And this is where we must end. Thank you so much for watching.